He was told his mother had been killed in the London Blitz when he was a baby. But at 14, he discovered she was alive. He tracked her down and visited her. This was her reaction.
She said it would be better if I never came back to see her again.
But Ray Barnett's pain of his mother's rejection was channeled into a positive purpose, his own personal mission to rescue other orphans.
I'd heard on the radio that 150,000 children were starving to death in northern Uganda.
Ray travelled to Uganda immediately. It was 1984. That trip was to lead to the formation of the African Children's Choir. This is Ray's story.
Well, actually, I was raised in the Coleraine area of County Derry in Northern Ireland, and I was born in the little seaside village nearby of Port Stewart. Where the differences came in, I didn't know it until much later in my life, but I was known as Raymond Ross. It was only when I was 14 that I discovered the real truth, went to get my birth certificate to get a job, and there was no such birth registered. That's when I was actually told that my name wasn't Raymond Ross, and that my mother had been, I'd been left there, and she'd gone to London and been killed in the London Blitz. That was the story that I was given.
Apart from not knowing his real family, Ray had a difficult time at school.
Like little difficulties. For example, I joined a marching band when I was 7, but I got put out of the band because I couldn't keep time with the triangle. So they took the triangle, and I don't know what possessed them. They tried me with the cymbals. That was even worse. Other kids were playing soccer, but I wasn't coordinated. In later years, you know, it developed that as they got to know more about it, I had a very, very severe case of dyslexia. I don't know my right foot to my left. And of course, then that seemed that I was given this idea that I was stupid.
Ray's first day at secondary school was embarrassingly disastrous.
Music teacher was my homeroom teacher, and she'd put me up in the front row of the choir when the first day she started, and I became so afraid and nervous that I fainted.
But the teacher later discovered that Ray had untapped potential.
One day, she noticed that I was the last person remaining in the class. The bell had gone, everybody had gone, but I was probably absorbed in the book, so she came and said, why are you not gone? I said, well, I'm sorry I didn't hear her. I was reading the book. And then she questioned me about the book. She said, I know this book, and could you repeat to me what you have read? And I told her. She was amazed, and I could see that even as a child. She was shocked. She said, Raymond, I don't know what's wrong, but you're reading way above and beyond anybody in this class.
The teacher went out of her way to help restore Ray's confidence.
She encouraged me to come to her house. Her father was a retired teacher, and they helped me get through things. And so that began to bolster my confidence, and I went on. I didn't like school. I could hardly wait to get to for school to finish. And in that time, you left school when you were 14.
Ray left school and managed to get a job in a photographic studio.
The first day I was working in the dark room, and there was a friend visiting the owner who was a photographer, and they were talking about David Livingstone, the great missionary, and asked me what I thought about that. No, I said maybe. I'd just seen a movie about David Livingstone. I would like to be a person like him. And he said, well, are you a Christian? I said, yes, because I'd gone to church. I was in a Church of Ireland and went to Sunday school and church. And he said, well, how do you hope to get to heaven? I replied, if I do the best I can, if I'm honest, if I'm sincere, then I hope to get to heaven. He said, no, that's not the way. And that statement changed my life because I wanted to know what was the way.
That lunchtime at his home, Ray closely followed the instructions he had been given.
In the afternoon, I came back and they were talking again, and there's something said, but he said, as I told you before, you have to be born again. I said, well, I went home. I got on my knees in my bedroom, confessed that I was a sinner and asked Christ to come into my heart. Is there something else? Well, this man was flabbergasted because he didn't think it could be that simple. But he recognized that. And I said, is there something else I have to do? Well, I said, you have to publicly confess Christ. So he said, he was a lay preacher. I'm going to speak in Londonderry at the Guildhall on Sunday night at a meeting. You could give your testimony there. Well, I was terrified of that.
In spite of his fear, Ray made his first attempt at public speaking.
I went to speak. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I immediately fainted. I was rescued. I just passed out, and they dragged me off the stage. And when I was brought round, I said, Lord, I'm going to do this every time. And if I faint, then that's your responsibility. But I never thought I would speak in public again. And a day or two later, I read, with God, nothing's impossible. That was the beginning of me discovering that with God, nothing's impossible. God can do anything if you only believe. But I learned through praying, spending maybe long nights on my knees, that that's when you've got to learn to listen to God when you pray, because you have to find out what your part in the answer to the thing you're praying for is, and what you can do. So that was to set the stage for an entire lifetime up until now. Part of my work in my teens was in a dry cleaning plant for a short time, and I was processing the clothes coming in for dry cleaning, found a dress and saw the address was Barnett's at Kilmore Point in Derry. So I thought, I wonder, is this my mother's dress? Now this is going back to when I was 15, when I had been told that they thought she had been killed in the Blitz. So I took the train a couple of days later to Derry and walked out to Kilmore Point.
Ray didn't find his mother on this trip. She had moved to live in London, but he did meet an uncle for the first time.
He said, what's happening? I said, well, I don't know how to say this, but your sister's my mother. And he knew that. He didn't really have to ask. He knew that instinctively. And he did give me her phone number. And when I went to London, I actually called her and went to see her. And this is the first time I'm actually telling this story, really. She said it would be better if I never came back to see her again. So the whole thing was shut off, and I had buried this and never mentioned it even to my foster mother, Mrs. Ross, or anybody else. I was so deeply in pain. This is something that caused me a great deal of suffering.
In spite of having to live with the pain of rejection, Ray still desired to find and fulfill God's purpose for his life.
Since I became a committed Christian when I was 13, my life was in God's hands, and I was more or less searching for what I believed that God wanted me to do with my life, and I thought that was going to be Christian ministry.
But Ray knew he would have to get some training, so at 16 he set off to London by train and boat.
I went there with, I think, £5 in my pocket to get a job and try to become involved in study for the ministry.
Near Westminster, Ray came across the headquarters of the Methodist Church. A group of senior clerics happened to be meeting there that day.
I went in and told them that I wanted advice in getting into the ministry. As a result, they took me in, got me a job in the Methodist Youth Department, and I wasn't even a Methodist. But later on it transpired that the local Methodist minister in the town of Coleraine had sent them a letter saying I was a Methodist lay preacher on trial, and they were amazed, that I didn't tell them that. Well, I didn't know that I was, but I told the children's story in the Methodist Church, and the minister very kindly had recognized me as being a lay preacher on trial in the church, and that opened lots of doors for me to speak.
But Ray also had his eyes opened to some theological issues within the wider Christian church.
These people were so absolutely kind, but then I discovered that they were the great liberals in the church, and didn't necessarily believe, some of them, in the virgin birth and that sort of thing. And that became a great struggle. And finally, in a struggle one night walking on the beach, I thought, what am I going to do? So that's when I come up with the fact that really I wanted to have an evangelical mind and liberal heart, and that set the stage, a very important stage in my life.
Ray ended up emigrating to Canada to go to Bible college in Saskatchewan. It was there he met and married Ruth Greaves. He also became ordained and carried out pastoral duties during the summer months. But his journey of faith meant taking one step at a time.
Normally, before you go through an open door, you'd want to see what the next door and the next door. I just understood that you go through the door that's open, and the Lord will open the next door when the time is right. And it became a question of waiting on God and going through the door that was open, and then right throughout life, it's going through the door that's opening, and that trust in God, it just doesn't fail.
Ray had formed a group to pray for Christians who had been imprisoned for their beliefs in the former Soviet Union. But he soon realized that faith demanded action.
We prayed for people who were in prison in the Cold Wars of the Soviet Union, in the gulags and detention camps through Siberia, who were there for nothing other than their Christian faith. We put their names out on bracelets, and with the little inscriptions, Hebrews 13:3, remember them that are in bonds as bound with them, and them which suffer adversity. Many of those people, under unusual circumstances, were released, but also there was actions that was taken.
As more action was needed, it became necessary to form a specialist organization.
The organization was called Friends in the West, small charity, because the people behind Iron Curtain countries and also in the Soviet Union, they used to write to me, "Dear friend in the West," and that's how the name Friends in the West came about.
One of the names on the prayer bracelet that Ray and his team distributed was that of a Baptist pastor, Georgie Vins.
He was in prison, very ill in a Siberian labor camp. His mother was in prison. His son was in prison, 3 generations. And we prayed for them, and then I wondered, okay, what else should we be doing to assist Pastor Vins? And I had gone to the United Nations to, bring information to see what they could do. And of course, the man that I got to talk to was an American diplomat who was head of the Human Rights Commission. He explained, "Ray, you can't do a thing because he's in a Soviet prison. The Soviet Union will just simply veto anything that's brought up." But he said, "I have an idea." He said, "Why don't we go to Washington and try and get a resolution passed through the United States Congress?"
So they did go to Washington, but after speaking with congressman after congressman, things didn't look very hopeful.
Nobody seemed to think that there was anything that could be done, but we found one congressman. His name was John Buchanan. He happened to be a Republican. Listened to us. He happened to have been a Baptist minister, so he had a lot of empathy. He said, "Don't think anything will happen, but if you write out what should be in a bill, we'll try and see if we can introduce it. At least it will be on the record." Well, we did, on a piece of brown paper, in the back of a piece of brown paper, and guy wrote it, and in fact, it said something like, the United States Congress condemns the Soviet Union for their treatment of Pastor Georgie Vins and other Christians who are imprisoned for nothing but their Christian faith. And he thought that would be that. But a couple of weeks later, he called me and said, "Look, Ray, can you help organize Foreign Relations Committee meetings, because over 100 congressmen want to co-sponsor this bill." It was unheard of.
Then it was on to the Senate. But it was approaching the end of the President Ford administration. New elections were coming up, and time was running out.
It was the last item of business to come up in the Senate before it was dismissed, and they went to new elections, and it passed just minutes before midnight, and that meant this bill was complete. I didn't know what good it would do, but it went through, and things about it got published in the Soviet Union, and all the Christians knew that there was some activity, somebody cared about them, and it was to play a big part later on. But this was another tremendous answer to prayer, whether it's in a government setting or wherever. Again, there was the reaffirmation that God does answer prayer, and God can do anything.
Ray didn't doubt that God could do anything, but by this stage he had been carrying the pain of his mother's rejection for many years and accepted the fact that there may not be an answer. Then, on a visit to his birthplace at Port Stewart, something astonishing took place.
I was praying. I had wondered if my life was going in the right direction, and I thought, Lord, somehow I need to hear from you. I was just getting ready to make a trip behind the Iron Curtain in the Cold War days. And then suddenly I prayed, and then I thought, okay, what am I going to do now for the rest of the afternoon? And looking across at the Derry area in Donegal, I thought I'll drive up and have a look at the place where my mother grew up, my birth mother. And, you know, off I go. It's the middle of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, lots of military checkpoints, and almost getting dark by the time I got to Culmore Point. And having a look at the old castle, it was desolate and deserted. And suddenly, from nowhere, an old fisherman appeared, just coming up from the water. I thought maybe he'd been pulling his boat up, and being troubled times, I thought I'd better explain why I was there, because I'd be a total stranger to him. And I said, well, my mother grew up in this place, and I never knew her. And I understand she was killed in the London Blitz. And he just, without any hesitation, surprised me by saying, no, she wasn't. She lives on, you give a number, 244 Lawn Terrace, New Rochelle, New York. And I was absolutely stunned and amazed. And he said, you also had a sister. And I didn't know that I had a sister. And he said her name was Iris, and the people who adopted her changed her name to Kathleen. And, you know, he just was so full of information. I went off feeling a lot lighter than I had coming, because I remembered I'd prayed that the Lord would specifically give me direction. And if I had been 2 minutes earlier, 2 minutes later, I'd have missed the old fisherman. There I was. I couldn't have a better answer to prayer. Plus, I'd learned information that was to send my life in quite a different direction.
Ray had information about a sister he never knew. It took a period of research, but eventually he tracked her address to Bournemouth in England. He had also obtained her telephone number.
I went into the telephone box and called. My sister answered, and my approach with her was that I was from Canada and I was doing research in my family and had discovered she might be related to me. You know, that was what I was going to say. But, she said, "Are you my brother?" She said, "We've been placing ads in Canadian newspapers to try and find you, because my mother finally told my husband about you coming to visit. And I prayed every day for you since I've been a child of 4 that you would come and find me someday."
Ray soon travelled to Bournemouth, where he met his sister Catherine, her husband Jim, and their 3 children, Debbie, Peter, and Sally.
We had a wonderful time together, and that began a long-time relationship. As a matter of fact, though Sally was very young then, when she left university, 19 or 20, she's worked first with Friends in the West, then with the African Children's Choir all her life. She's the field director now for East Africa.
As a result of meeting the old fisherman, Ray didn't just find his sister. He was also able to track down his mother, by now living in New York. Decades after his last encounter as a teenager, she was actually glad to see him this time.
I did find her in the United States. We did get reunited. She did fly out to Vancouver and saw her grandchildren, and so I did get to know her before her death, and actually went to her funeral with my family, her grandchildren in New York, New Rochelle in New York a few years ago.
By now, the work of Friends in the West had expanded to include the Middle East and Africa. When Ray heard that 150,000 orphans were starving to death in northern Uganda, he knew he had to try to help.
I went to see the Prime Minister of the day then. It was the Obote regime. Idi Amin was gone, but there was a a heavy civil war in addition to the famine going on in Uganda, the Prime Minister of the day said, Ray, there's more orphans in the Luwero Triangle. That's an area of Uganda it takes about an hour to drive to today from Kampala. He just simply said, there's more orphans in this area than there are children dying in northern Uganda. Could you help there? And I explained to him that I was a little bit discouraged seeing all the pictures. It seemed like acres of children with little tin cups, and they were emaciated. And what hope? And I felt, he said, well, they have to do that to raise money, Ray, you understand. And I said, I did, and I really did. But I thought that, and I told him so, that the world needed to see the brighter side of the African child. And I give him an example of a little boy. My team and myself give a ride to from one village to another, and he sang for us the whole way a little chorus about getting to heaven, but he pronounced it haven. And we recorded it, and it kept us going for days. I said, that's the image that the world needs to see of the African child, the dignity, the unlimited ability, the potential, with just a little bit of help. And he said, well, what are you going to do about it? I said, well, maybe, like that little boy, maybe an African children's choir. And 6 months later, though through civil war, all kinds of difficulties, I said, well, how would we get passports for orphans? How would we get visas? And he said, well, I'll help you get the passports. You can get the visas. He gave me the difficult job. 6 months later, the first choir came to Vancouver in Canada. And that is actually how the link was made with Africa and the African Children's Choir. And here we are now, almost coming up or starting to plan for our 30th anniversary 30 years later.